What if I told you that behind the flawless red carpets, Oscar wins, and powerful on-screen roles, some of Hollywood's most famous black actresses were hiding urges they couldn't control? At the height of their fame, they looked untouchable. Cameras loved them, fans worshipped them, but behind closed doors, rumors swirled about dangerous habits, secret affairs, and lives spinning quietly out of control. These stories were whispered, buried, or twisted to protect careers and reputations. Tonight, we're pulling the curtain back. These are 18 of the most shocking and controversial stories Hollywood never wanted you to hear. How much was truth, and what was carefully erased? 18. Diahann Carroll. Diahann Carroll's name often comes up when people talk about Hollywood's long history of labeling black actresses instead of understanding them. From the very start, she was placed in a tiny box. She was glamorous, successful, and visible at a time when black women were rarely allowed to be any of those things on screen. Hollywood loved her beauty, but feared her independence. As her fame grew, so did the stories about her private life. Multiple high-profile romances and marriages became headline material, and instead of asking why she searched so hard for love, the industry rushed to judge her desires. Behind the spotlight, Carroll spoke honestly about emotional hunger and the pressure of always being perfect. She admitted that relationships became deeply tied to validation, safety, and self-worth. In an industry that offered little emotional support to black women, intimacy often became the only place where she felt fully seen. Over time, media narratives twisted this vulnerability into something darker, painting her as excessive rather than human. The label followed her quietly, whispered in gossip columns, and repeated in Hollywood circles without care. What's often ignored is how limited her choices truly were. Roles were scarce, expectations were brutal, and personal mistakes were magnified far more than those of her peers. Carroll later reflected on how fame distorted her understanding of love and stability, pushing her into cycles that looked dramatic from the outside but felt necessary at the time. Her story fits the title not as a diagnosis, but as an example of how Hollywood historically framed black actresses' intimacy as a problem instead of a response to isolation, pressure, and survival. If stories like Diahann Carroll's make you see Hollywood differently, don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel and stay with us as we uncover more hidden sides of fame, power, and the truths history tried to smooth over. 17. Josephine Baker. Josephine Baker's story sits at the crossroads of fame, freedom, and harsh judgment. Rising from deep poverty to become an international sensation, she shocked the world with her confidence, sensual performances, and refusal to be ashamed of her body. In Europe, she was celebrated as bold and modern. In Hollywood and the American press, however, that same freedom was quickly twisted into scandal. Her open attitude toward relationships and desire was treated as dangerous, especially because she was a black woman refusing to shrink herself. Baker never hid the fact that intimacy played a major role in her emotional life. She moved through relationships intensely, often tying love to safety and survival. Fame came fast, but stability never followed. Hollywood critics labeled her excessive, wild, and uncontrollable, projecting moral panic onto her private life, rather than acknowledging how racism and exile shaped her choices. She was banned from venues, monitored by governments, and constantly pushed to the margins, which only deepened her emotional isolation. What rarely gets discussed is how Baker used intimacy as resistance. In a world determined to police her body, she claimed ownership over it. Over time, that behavior was framed by outsiders as compulsive rather than contextual. Her name became shorthand for sexual excess, even though her life was also filled with discipline, activism, and sacrifice. Josephine Baker fits this title because Hollywood history often chose to sensationalize her desire instead of understanding how a woman denied safety, belonging, and home searched for connection wherever she could find it. 16. Niecy Nash. Niecy Nash spent years being seen as safe, funny, and familiar, the kind of actress Hollywood loves, until she decides to grow. For a long time, her personal life stayed out of headlines, but that changed as she stepped into a new phase of self-discovery. After multiple marriages and divorces, Nash began speaking openly about reclaiming joy, desire, and emotional honesty. The moment she did, public opinion shifted. What had once been praised as strength was suddenly framed as instability. As Nash explored new relationships later in life, the media narrative quickly became harsh. Her openness about love and sexuality was reduced to oversimplified labels. Instead of recognizing a woman finally choosing herself after years of compromise, Hollywood gossip turned it into a story of excess. The idea that a mature black woman could want passion, closeness, and freedom unsettled audiences used to seeing her contained. Nash herself has explained that earlier relationships were rooted in survival, responsibility, and expectation rather than fulfillment. Once those chains broke, Diahann felt louder and more urgent. That transition was misunderstood, with outsiders projecting compulsive behavior onto what was actually personal growth. Her story reflects how quickly women, especially black women, are punished for evolving publicly. In the context of this title, Niecy Nash represents how Hollywood often confuses self-liberation with loss of control, rewriting personal healing into something controversial and uncomfortable for public consumption. 15. Meagan Good grew up in the spotlight with strict rules, heavy supervision, and constant messages about purity and restraint. As a child actress, she was protected but also controlled, taught to suppress desire rather than understand it. That repression followed her into adulthood, where public expectations clashed with private curiosity. When she later spoke about struggling to balance faith, marriage, and sexuality, many were shocked by her honesty. Good admitted that early teachings left her unprepared for healthy intimacy. Desire became something confusing, swinging between denial and intensity. When her marriage ended, media outlets rushed to rewrite her story, suggesting reckless behavior instead of emotional rebuilding. Hollywood narratives painted her transformation as sudden and excessive, ignoring the years of silence and self-denial that came before. Rather than framing her journey as healing, the industry leaned into sensationalism. Any expression of confidence or sensuality was exaggerated into controversy. Good has consistently explained that her evolution was about learning balance, not losing control. Still, the label stuck, fueled by a culture uncomfortable with black women openly redefining their relationship with sex outside religious or marital boundaries. Her inclusion in this list reflects how Hollywood often mistakes recovery from repression as indulgence, reducing complex emotional growth into a shallow storyline built for judgment instead of understanding. 14. Jada Pinkett Smith. Jada Pinkett Smith's personal life has been dissected more than almost any other black actress of her generation. Intelligent, outspoken, and deeply introspective, she never fit Hollywood's idea of quiet respectability. Over the years, she openly discussed emotional dependency, intense attachments, and the ways fame blurred her understanding of intimacy. That honesty made her relatable to some and deeply uncomfortable to others. Jada admitted that relationships once became a coping mechanism during periods of emptiness and identity loss. Rather than hiding those struggles, she addressed them publicly, which shifted the conversation, but also amplified criticism. Hollywood headlines focused on labels instead of context, flattening her admissions into a scandal. The complexity of healing was lost beneath viral clips and oversimplified takes. What's often overlooked is how intentional her self-reflection has been. She framed her experiences as lessons learned through pain, not behavior to glorify. Still, the industry preferred a shocking narrative. Her story fits this title not because of a medical claim, but because it shows how quickly transparency is weaponized. Jada Pinkett Smith became an example of how a woman's attempt to explain her past can be reshaped into a permanent identity. Hollywood history frequently turns self-awareness into controversy, especially when a black actress refuses to stay silent about desire, attachment, and emotional truth. 13. Kim Fields. Kim Fields grew up on television, surrounded by structure, rules, and expectations long before she understood who she really was. As a child star, her image was tightly managed. She was cast as wholesome, disciplined, and safe, leaving very little room for curiosity or emotional freedom. Behind the scenes, however, that control created confusion. When adulthood arrived, so did a quiet rebellion against everything she had been taught to suppress. Fields later spoke about how growing up under constant supervision delayed her emotional development. Intimacy became complicated because she never had the space to explore it naturally. Relationships carried intense weight, often tied to identity rather than companionship. When tabloids caught hints of her private struggles, Hollywood rushed to frame them as instability instead of delayed self-discovery. The industry rarely allowed her the grace to grow privately. What followed was a familiar pattern. Any romantic change was magnified. Any personal choice was dissected. The narrative shifted from talented former child star to someone portrayed as conflicted and excessive. What was missing from the conversation was context. Years of restriction can create intensity later in life, especially when desire and autonomy finally meet. Kim Fields' story connects to this title because Hollywood has a long history of misunderstanding women who grow up under pressure. Her experiences show how a suppressed identity can later appear overwhelming to outsiders. Rather than asking how control shaped her relationship with intimacy, the industry chose easier labels, turning personal evolution into quiet controversy instead of a natural human response to a childhood lived on display. 12. Gabrielle Union. Gabrielle Union has never shied away from difficult truths. Her openness about trauma, healing, and intimacy set her apart in an industry built on silence. Early in her life, she survived sexual violence, an experience that deeply shaped how she later approached relationships. She admitted that for years, intimacy was tangled with control, validation, and fear of abandonment. Union explained that success did not erase emotional wounds. Fame amplified them. Relationships became intense, sometimes chaotic, because they were tied to healing something much older than Hollywood. When she later spoke about infidelity in her marriage, media narratives reduced her honesty to moral failure, ignoring the psychological complexity she openly described. Rather than framing her story as growth, Hollywood leaned into judgment. Desire was painted as recklessness. Vulnerability was twisted into weakness. What Union actually modeled was accountability and emotional maturity, but that nuance rarely survives headlines. Her willingness to discuss intimacy as part of recovery made her an easy target for oversimplified labels. Gabrielle Union fits this list because her experiences reveal how trauma can distort intimacy and how transparency can be punished. Hollywood often prefers silence over explanation. When a black actress speaks openly about sex, pain, and healing, the system responds with discomfort. Her story highlights how real struggles are often flattened into damaging narratives instead of understood as steps toward wholeness. 11. Nia Long. Nia Long built a career playing desirable, confident women, and that image followed her off-screen, whether she wanted it or not. For decades, her beauty and romantic roles shaped how audiences perceived her personal life. Every relationship became public property, and every breakup fueled speculation. Over time, the line between character and reality disappeared. Long rarely spoke publicly about her private struggles, which allowed tabloids to fill in the gaps. She was repeatedly portrayed as someone defined by desire rather than depth. When high-profile relationships ended, Hollywood framed the pattern as a flaw instead of a reflection of industry pressure and constant scrutiny. What's often ignored is how exhausting that projection can be. Being constantly sexualized creates expectations that are impossible to escape. Intimacy becomes performative, even in private life, because the world insists on seeing you one way. That pressure can distort how love and connection are experienced. Nia Long's place in this title comes from how Hollywood constructed her narrative, not from her own claims. She represents how repeated public relationships are often mischaracterized as excess. Instead of recognizing the toll of being permanently objectified, the industry chose shallow interpretations. Her story shows how perception can become reality when a woman is never allowed to exist outside the fantasy others create for her. 10. Lisa Raye McCoy. Lisa Raye McCoy's personal life played out in public long before reality television made that normal. From high-profile marriages to public accusations of betrayal, her relationships became entertainment. Hollywood and tabloids treated her emotional pain as spectacle, turning deeply personal moments into ongoing storylines. McCoy spoke openly about trust issues, control, and patterns that repeated despite her success. She admitted that love often felt intense and consuming, shaped by both desire and fear. Instead of understanding honesty, media outlets focused on the scandal. Each new relationship reinforced an image they had already decided on. What's rarely acknowledged is how visibility limits healing. When every mistake is public, growth becomes harder. Intimacy becomes reactive, driven by the need to feel chosen or secure. Hollywood framed her openness as instability rather than self-awareness, ignoring the emotional context behind her choices. Lisa Raye McCoy fits this list because her story shows how repeated heartbreak can be misread as compulsion. The industry often prefers dramatic labels over empathy. Her life reflects how Black actresses are judged more harshly for their private struggles, especially when they refuse to hide them. Instead of space to heal, she was given a narrative that followed her for years, proving how quickly vulnerability can be turned into a permanent reputation. 9. Tiffany Haddish. Tiffany Haddish's rise came from chaos, pain, and survival rather than comfort. Before fame, she experienced homelessness, instability, and repeated emotional losses. When success finally arrived, it did not erase those wounds. Instead, it magnified them. Haddish openly admitted that for a long time, intimacy was tied to validation. Being wanted felt like proof that she mattered in a world that had often ignored her. She spoke candidly about using the relationships as emotional anchors during periods of loneliness and insecurity. Rather than hiding that truth, she laughed about it, owned it, and tried to understand it. Hollywood, however, rarely allows that level of honesty without consequences. Her openness was reframed as recklessness, with desire painted as a lack of control instead of a response to long-term neglect and trauma. As her fame grew, so did the scrutiny. Every romantic move became a headline. Instead of acknowledging her growth and self-awareness, the industry leaned into caricature. Loud, bold, and sexually confident became the only traits people discussed, erasing her emotional depth. Tiffany Haddish fits this title because her story shows how survival-based intimacy can be misunderstood. What she described as healing and self-discovery was often flattened into a stereotype. Hollywood struggled to accept a Black woman who could be vulnerable, sexual, and self-reflective at the same time. Her journey reveals how easily honesty about desire is mistaken for excess when context is ignored. 8. Monique. Monique has never followed Hollywood's rules quietly. From the beginning, she spoke openly about sex, marriage, and desire in ways that made the industry uncomfortable. She discussed open relationships, emotional honesty, and personal boundaries without apology. That refusal to conform quickly turned her into a target. Rather than listening to what she actually said, Hollywood simplified her message. Sexual openness was mischaracterized as instability. Confidence was reframed as defiance. Monique repeatedly explained that her choices were rooted in communication and self-awareness, not chaos. Still, narratives formed around her that were difficult to escape. Her willingness to challenge respectability politics placed her at odds with an industry that prefers silence from Black women. Instead of being seen as someone defining intimacy on her own terms, she was labeled and sidelined. That label followed her even as she continued to clarify her position. Monique's place in this list reflects how sexual honesty can be punished. Hollywood often demands that Black actresses perform purity or mystery, not truth. Her story highlights how control over one's body and relationships is quickly framed as excess when it does not align with industry comfort. She became an example of how speaking freely about sex can cost a woman her standing, even when no harm is being done. 7. Raven-Symoné. Raven-Symoné entered fame at an age when identity is still forming. Growing up in front of cameras meant that boundaries were constantly blurred. She later spoke about being exposed to adult environments too early and struggling to understand intimacy in healthy ways. Childhood fame shaped her relationship with desire long before she could consent to that influence. As she matured, Raven addressed confusion, pressure, and the long-term effects of early sexualization. Rather than receiving empathy, her honesty was met with discomfort. Hollywood preferred nostalgia over accountability, avoiding deeper conversations about what child stars endure behind the scenes. Her relationships and self-expression became topics of speculation. Instead of recognizing healing, media outlets focused on difference. Any deviation from expectation was exaggerated into controversy. The narrative shifted away from survival and toward judgment. Raven-Symoné's story fits this title because it shows how early exposure can distort intimacy later in life. What appeared sudden or intense to outsiders was often the result of years of unresolved confusion. Hollywood rarely acknowledges its role in shaping those outcomes. Her journey exposes how the industry creates conditions it later condemns, especially when former child stars begin reclaiming control over their bodies and identities. 6. Eartha Kitt. Eartha Kitt was unapologetic in a time that punished Black women for confidence. She spoke openly about her desires, refused to pretend innocence, and rejected the idea that women should hide pleasure. That honesty made her powerful and dangerous in the eyes of Hollywood. Rather than celebrating her independence, the industry labeled her excessive. Her relationships were scrutinized, her sexuality sensationalized, and her confidence reframed as instability. Kitt herself explained that intimacy was about honesty and choice, not shame. Still, the narrative around her hardened. After political exile and professional punishment, isolation deepened. Love and desire became spaces of refuge in a world that repeatedly shut its doors. Instead of understanding that context, history reduced her to a caricature. Eartha Kitt belongs on this list because she represents how Black female sexuality has been policed through labeling. Hollywood chose to brand her rather than confront its discomfort. Her life shows how autonomy can be misread as compulsion when a woman refuses to apologize for knowing what she wants. 5. Lena Horne. Lena Horne lived in an era where Black women were watched, limited, and quietly punished for stepping outside approved lines. She was stunning, talented, and intelligent, yet Hollywood never fully accepted her as an equal. Studio executives controlled her image tightly, while her private life became a place where she searched for freedom. Relationships often carry deep emotional weight because they offered something the industry refused to give her: safety and belonging. Horne later reflected on how isolation shaped her choices. She was admired from a distance, but excluded socially, romantically, and professionally. That loneliness made intimacy feel urgent and necessary. Love was not casual for her. It was tied to survival, affirmation, and escape from constant rejection. Hollywood gossip reduced this complexity into whispers about her personal life, painting desire as excess instead of response. Because interracial relationships were taboo, secrecy surrounded many of her romances. That secrecy intensified emotional attachment and made endings more painful. Rather than acknowledging how racism forced her into hidden spaces, the industry framed her private struggles as moral weakness. The label followed quietly, shaping how history remembered her. Lena Horne fits this title because Hollywood repeatedly misunderstood her humanity. Her need for closeness was treated as indulgence instead of a reaction to systemic exclusion. Her story shows how desire becomes magnified when a woman is denied a normal connection. She was not reckless, she was restricted. In that environment, intimacy became one of the few places where she felt fully alive, even as the world judged her for it. 4. Pam Grier. Pam Grier rose to fame as a symbol of power, danger, and sexuality. On screen, she was fearless. Off-screen, Hollywood struggled to separate the roles from the woman. Her confidence and physical presence made people assume things about her private life that were rarely questioned. Relationships became headlines, and Diwer was treated as her defining trait. Grier later explained that fame distorted how men approached her. Intimacy often came with power struggles, expectations, and exploitation. Being desired did not always mean being respected. Over time, that imbalance created emotional exhaustion. Love became intense, complicated, and sometimes painful. Hollywood framed her openness as excess while ignoring the environment it created. She was placed in roles that celebrated her body, but rarely protected her heart. Relationships blurred into survival, especially in an industry where women were disposable once youth faded. Pam Grier belongs on this list because her sexuality was never neutral. It was projected, consumed, and judged. The idea that she might struggle privately was ignored. Her story reflects how constant sexualization can distort intimacy, turning connection into performance. Instead of offering support, Hollywood chose labels, reducing a complex woman into a symbol that followed her long after the cameras stopped rolling. 3. Janet Jackson. Janet Jackson's relationship with intimacy cannot be separated from control, silence, and pressure. From childhood, her life was managed down to the smallest detail. Her image, body, and emotions were monitored long before she had the language to understand desire. Privacy did not exist. Mistakes were not allowed. In that environment, sexuality became something hidden rather than explored, stored away instead of understood. That kind of repression does not disappear. It waits. As an adult, Jackson spoke about secrecy shaping her relationships. Love happened behind closed doors, intense and emotionally loaded. When intimacy finally became a place of freedom, it carried years of unmet emotional need. Fame made vulnerability dangerous, so attachment grew deeper in private. To outsiders, her shifts in confidence and expression seemed sudden. In reality, they were the result of decades of restraint finally loosening. When her image evolved into one of ownership and sensual control, Hollywood reacted harshly. Instead of seeing growth, the industry framed her as excessive. Public controversies erased nuance, flattening her emotional journey into scandal. What was ignored was how long she had been denied autonomy. desire did not come from recklessness. It came from the silence breaking. Janet Jackson fits this title because Hollywood repeatedly misread her humanity. Her intimacy was shaped by control, not indulgence. When she finally claimed her body and emotions as her own, the response was punishment, not understanding. Her story reflects how repression can turn desire into something powerful and misunderstood once freedom arrives. 2. Whitney Houston. Whitney Houston's private struggles were as intense as her public success. She spoke openly about relationships that blurred love, pain, and escape. Intimacy became deeply tied to validation and safety, especially as fame isolated her from normal connections. The brighter her spotlight became, the harder it was to trust who loved her and who loved the image. Houston admitted that relationships often filled emotional gaps that success could not touch. Love felt overwhelming because it carried identity, belonging, and survival all at once. That intensity made boundaries difficult to maintain. Instead of support, Hollywood turned her vulnerability into spectacle. Every personal struggle became an entertainment. Desire was often framed as part of her downfall, rather than a symptom of deeper wounds. Trauma, pressure, and loneliness were ignored in favor of easier narratives. The industry reduced complex pain into blame. Intimacy was treated as a weakness instead of a coping mechanism shaped by isolation. Whitney Houston fits this title not as a diagnosis, but as a reflection of how emotional need can become entangled with desire. Her story shows how fame magnifies wounds instead of healing them. Rather than compassion, she was given judgment. Her life remains a reminder of how Hollywood consumes vulnerability while offering little protection in return. 1. Halle Berry. Halle Berry's personal life has been judged almost as much as her career. From the outside, she looked like someone who had everything: beauty, awards, fame, and success. But behind that image, her relationships told a different story. Multiple marriages, painful breakups, and very public heartbreak followed her for years. Instead of asking why she kept searching for love, Hollywood focused on counting her failures and attaching labels. Berry later spoke openly about emotional dependency. She admitted that she often tied her self-worth to being loved. Intimacy became more than connection. It became proof that she mattered beyond the spotlight. When relationships ended, the emotional fallout was deep, not dramatic for attention, but painful in a very real way. Those moments were rarely handled with care by the media. Her vulnerability became entertainment. Being constantly desired by the world while feeling unseen as a person creates an imbalance. Berry explained that she wanted stability, safety, and emotional grounding, not chaos. Still, every new relationship was framed as another mistake before it even began. The pressure of perfection left little room to heal privately. Each attempt at love happened under a microscope. Hollywood rarely allowed her to be human. Instead of recognizing patterns shaped by trauma, expectation, and isolation, the industry reduced her story to shallow narratives. Her honesty about struggling emotionally challenged the idea that success protects you from pain. That truth made people uncomfortable. Halle Berry fits this title because her desire for love was repeatedly misunderstood. Her story is not about excess, but about searching. It shows how repeated heartbreak can look like compulsion when empathy is missing. Rather than support, she was given judgment, proving how little space Hollywood gives women to heal without being defined by their wounds. So now you've heard the stories Hollywood tried to keep quiet. Fame gave them everything, yet it also fed desires that often went unchecked behind closed doors. Some survived the chaos. Others paid a heavy price while the industry looked the other way. But it leaves one big question hanging in the air. How many more stories like these are still buried, waiting to be exposed. If this video shocked you, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe for more untold Hollywood secrets, and share this with someone who loves the real stories behind the spotlight. Which story surprised you the most?